The deed hit the floor of the Crockett County Courthouse like a thunderclap, and every man in that room went absolutely still. Louise Talmadge stood at the center of the chaos with dust still coating her riding boots and her dark hair falling loose from its pins, and she did not flinch. Not once. She had ridden 37 miles through the night to reach this moment, and the paper she had just slammed onto Judge Harlan Pemberton's oak desk was going to change everything, or it was going to get her killed before sundown. "That document," declared Silas Brock from across the room, his thick voice carrying the false confidence of a man whose plans had just fractured, "is a forgery. Everyone in this county knows the Ashford water rights lapsed in 1881. The Cottonwood Creek allocation belongs to the Brock Land and Cattle Company, and no piece of paper dragged out of some hole in the ground is going to change that." Louise looked at Silas Brock the way a surveyor looks at disputed terrain, with absolute precision and no room for sentiment. "It is not a forgery," she said quietly. "It is a notarized deed of water allocation filed originally with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe on March the 14th, 1873, bearing the signature of Territorial Governor William Pyle and witnessed by 2 justices of the peace. The lapse you are describing, Mr. Brock, was manufactured. The clerk who filed the lapse notice was on your payroll. I have his signed confession as well." She set a second document beside the first. The room was so silent that the tick of the wall clock sounded like a hammer. Judge Pemberton leaned forward, spectacles sliding down his nose, and his hands were trembling slightly as he reached for the deed. Alfred Ashford stood against the back wall of the courthouse with his hat in both hands and his jaw set hard, and he was staring at this woman, this impossible, infuriating, breathtaking woman, as though he were seeing her for the very first time, which, in every way that mattered, he was. 3 weeks earlier, he had been standing in the exact center of his ranch and watching everything he had built dissolve like sugar in a creek. The summer of 1883 had arrived in the New Mexico Territory like a punishment from God. The sky above the Ashford Ranch, a 12,000-acre spread of grassland and canyon country southeast of Santa Fe in a region locals called the Red Flats, had not produced meaningful rainfall since the previous November. The earth was cracked and pale, the graze was thin, and Cottonwood Creek, the lifeblood of the operation, the source that fed the stock tanks and the kitchen garden and the small apple orchard Alfred's mother had planted the year she arrived as a young bride, had dropped to a trickle. And then Silas Brock had sent his men to divert it entirely. Alfred was 29 years old that summer. He had inherited the ranch from his father, Cornelius Ashford, who had died of a fever 3 winters prior, and he had been running it alone ever since with a crew of 6 hands and a cook named Domingo who was 70 years old, nearly blind, and absolutely refused to retire. The ranch carried 2,000 head of cattle, a small horse breeding operation, and a debt to the First Territorial Bank of Santa Fe that was manageable barely when the water flowed. When Silas Brock's engineers threw up the diversion dam on the upper fork of Cottonwood Creek in early June of 1883, the debt became unmanageable almost immediately. Alfred had gone to the courthouse the first week of June. He had stood in front of Clerk Wendell Price and asked to see the water allocation records for the Ashford Ranch. Price, a small, sweating man with ink-stained fingers and a habit of not meeting people's eyes, had produced a ledger and pointed to an entry dated October 1881. The entry stated, in clipped bureaucratic language, that the water allocation originally granted to Cornelius Ashford in 1873 had lapsed due to non-renewal and had subsequently been acquired by the Brock Land and Cattle Company through proper territorial procedure. Alfred had stared at that entry for a long time. He had ridden home. He had sat on the porch of the ranch house in the dark, listening to the thin sound of the diminished creek and the anxious lowing of cattle that weren't getting enough to drink, and he had tried to think of what his father would have done. Cornelius Ashford had been a man of extraordinary stubbornness and modest formal education, and he had trusted the territorial government, the way most men of his generation trusted the weather provisionally, reluctantly, and with the full understanding that it would eventually betray you. He had never mentioned a renewal filing to Alfred, but he also had never mentioned allowing the water rights to lapse. Alfred had hired a lawyer in Santa Fe, a man named Fletcher Graves, who wore a clean suit and charged expensive rates, and ultimately told Alfred, very apologetically, that there was nothing to be done. The lapse was on the books. The Brock acquisition was registered. Without evidence of fraud, the legal standing was clear. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford," Graves had said, folding his clean hands on his clean desk. "The record as it stands belongs to Brock." Alfred had paid the man's fee, ridden home, and started making the brutal calculations of what he would have to sell and when. It was Domingo who had mentioned Louise Talmadge. The old cook had said it casually over breakfast one morning in late June, setting down a plate of salt pork and sourdough biscuits, and remarking that he had heard in town that the woman who used to work for the Territorial Land Survey Office was back in the county. She had been living out at the old Talmadge homestead, the one that sat 6 miles east of the Ashford property on the far side of a red sandstone ridge. She had come back after her father died in the spring to settle the estate. "She used to work for the government?" Alfred had asked. "Not just worked," Domingo had said, in the tone of a man sharing a secret he found privately amusing. "They say she was the one doing the actual surveying, drew half the boundary maps for this county herself. Sharp as a whip, that girl. Her father was a good man. She grew up reading land law the way other girls read the Bible." Alfred had finished his breakfast and told himself he did not need to go ask for help from a woman he had never met who might or might not know anything useful about territorial land records. He had lasted 4 more days before the main stock tank ran completely dry. He rode east over the sandstone ridge on a Thursday morning with the sun already brutal at 9 o'clock, and he found the Talmadge homestead in a state of productive disorder. The fences were being mended. A kitchen garden was being watered with careful efficiency from a hand-dug cistern. 2 horses grazed in a small paddock that had been recently repaired with new posts and fresh wire. And Louise Talmadge was on the roof of the barn, replacing shingles. She was wearing practical clothing, a divided skirt of dark wool, a plain linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and worn leather boots that had seen serious use. She was perhaps 26 years old, with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes that assessed Alfred from the rooftop with the same calm, professional precision with which he might assess a horse at auction. She had a hammer in one hand and a mouthful of nails, and she finished the shingle she was working on before she descended the ladder with the easy confidence of someone who had no interest in performing helplessness for an audience. "Mr. Ashford," she said when she reached the ground. She already knew who he was. "What brings you over the ridge?" He had not expected her directness. He had been prepared for a certain kind of exchange, the polite frontier dance of small talk and weather commentary that preceded any serious request. He found himself simply telling her the truth instead. "Brock has diverted my water. The county record shows my allocation lapsed in 1881. My lawyer says there's nothing to be done. But something about that record doesn't sit right with me, and I was told you know land allocation law better than anyone in this county." She had studied him for a moment. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of quiet physical authority that came from years of hard outdoor work rather than any conscious effort at intimidation. He was holding his hat in his hands, which she noticed. A man who takes his hat off when asking a woman for something serious was either genuinely respectful or very good at performing respect. She had learned the difference early. "Come inside," she said. "I have the territorial allocation codes from 1870 through 1882 in my father's study. Let's look at what should have happened." That had been the beginning. What Alfred had expected was a brief consultation. What he got was Louise Talmadge settling into her father's leather chair with a stack of government documents taller than his forearm, and proceeding to read through them with a focus so absolute and so quietly ferocious that he found himself sitting in the opposite chair for 3 hours, watching her work, and feeling something shift in the architecture of his assumptions about the world. She read the way surveyors read maps for what was present, for what was absent, and for where the discrepancies lived. She made notes in a precise, small hand. She cross-referenced dates. She set 2 documents side by side and held them up to the window light in a way that reminded him of the way his father used to hold a coin up to the sun to check whether it was true. The 1873 allocation was under the Territorial Water Rights Act of that year, she said at one point, not looking up from the page. Under that act, renewals were not required for allocations on established homestead ranches of over 5,000 acres. The lapse mechanism Brock is citing only applied to commercial extraction permits, not to residential agricultural allocations. Alfred sat forward, so the renewal was never required. That's what I need to verify. The question is whether the original deed used residential agricultural language or commercial extraction language. If it used the right language, and if your father's deed was filed correctly, there was no lapse possible under the law as it existed in 1873. She set down the document. Do you have a copy of the original 1873 deed? He shook his head. My father kept all the property documents in a strongbox. The strongbox was in the house. There was a fire in the spring of 1880. Outbuilding caught and spread to one corner of the house before we got it out. The strongbox survived, but when I opened it after my father died, the deed was gone. I assumed it burned. Louise was quiet for a moment. Where was the strongbox in the house? East corner bedroom, my father's room. And the fire spread from which direction? He blinked. From the west side. The barn was west of the house. She looked at him steadily. Then the east corner would have been the last part of the house touched by the fire, or perhaps untouched entirely. And a strongbox, even one that lost a paper document inside, would leave ash residue. Did you find ash residue where the deed would have been? He thought about it. He thought about it harder than he had thought about anything in a long time. No, he said slowly. No, I didn't. I assumed the fire had gotten it somehow. But there was no ash where the papers should have been. Louise set down her pen. Someone removed that deed before you had a chance to look for it, Mr. Ashford. Someone who knew what it contained and knew that without it, the lapse fiction would hold. He stared at her. The dark past of this whole arrangement was suddenly visible to him, the shape of a trap he had been walking through without knowing its walls existed. Brock, he said, or someone working for Brock. The question is whether the original deed still exists somewhere, or whether it was destroyed. If it was destroyed, we need a certified copy from the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. She paused. I need to make a trip. The word I stopped him. You would do that, ride to Santa Fe on my behalf. She looked at him with those direct dark eyes, and there was something in her expression that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it. I would ride to Santa Fe to solve a problem that interests me professionally, Mr. Ashford. Your behalf is secondary. He had found himself smiling without intending to. Of course. I'll charge you for my time and expenses, she added. I am not a charitable institution. Of course, he said again. Name your rate. She named it. It was fairer than Fletcher Graves had been, and considerably more likely to produce results. Alfred agreed without negotiation, which seemed to mildly surprise her, and that surprised him in turn, because it suggested that people had tried to negotiate her rates down before, which made him quietly furious on her behalf in a way he kept carefully to himself. The ride to Santa Fe was not something Louise had asked him to join, but he showed up at her gate the morning she was leaving with 2 horses saddled and a pack horse loaded with supplies. She had stood in her doorway and studied this arrangement for a long moment. I told you I would handle the research, she said. You did, he agreed. But the road between here and Santa Fe goes through 2 stretches of canyon that Brock's men know well, And Brock knows you're onto something because I made the mistake of asking his foreman yesterday about the diversion dam, which means he knows I'm still fighting this. I'm not suggesting you need protection." He paused. "I'm suggesting that you'd rather not have to interrupt your research to deal with ambush." It was the right thing to say, framed exactly right, and she knew it. She had already considered the route and the risk. She had already decided she could manage it. But two were faster than one on a road with potential ambush points, and Alfred Ashford's presence would be, at minimum, a deterrent. "You stay out of the land office," she said, collecting her saddlebag and pulling the door shut behind her. "I do the research, I do the talking. You stand outside and look intimidating, which appears to come naturally." He said nothing. He just moved to hold her horse while she mounted, and she noticed that he did it without fanfare, the way you do it for anyone, not with the elaborate performance of assistance that some men offered women to remind them they were women. They rode out together under a sky still pale with early morning, the sandstone country opening around them in layers of red and ochre, and the dusty gray-green of desert sage. The road between the Red Flats and Santa Fe covered roughly 90 miles through terrain that was beautiful and inhospitable in equal measure. They made good time the first day, following the flatter ground through the mesa country, and camped that night at a rocky bend in a dry wash where the stone walls on 3 sides provided both windbreak and cover. Alfred had brought more food than Louise had planned for, which she acknowledged with a nod that contained genuine approval. He cooked it without asking whether she wanted him to or suggesting that cooking was her natural province, and she ate beside the small fire and looked at the stars and felt, to her own mild surprise, something loosening in the habitual vigilance with which she had been operating since her father died. "How long were you with the land office?" Alfred asked. She poured coffee from the tin pot without looking at him. 4 years, 1878 to 1882. I joined as a document clerk and ended up doing survey work because the actual surveyor broke his leg in the 2nd month and someone had to finish the job. And I had been doing informal survey work with my father since I was 12. Your father was a surveyor, land agent, but he understood survey work. He taught me trigonometry and the use of a theodolite when I was 9 years old. She paused. He thought it was important for me to know how land was measured, because land was the only thing worth arguing about in this country, and he believed that the person who could read a map correctly would always have power over the person who could not. He sounds like a remarkable man. She was quiet for a moment, and the space around that silence had a particular quality that Alfred recognized, the quality of grief that had been carefully managed rather than felt through. He died in April, his heart. She drank her coffee. He left me the homestead and $400 and an entire room full of documents that I am still organizing. I'm sorry for your loss, Alfred said, and he said it simply, without embellishment, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated something elaborate. I'm sorry about your father too, she said. Domingo told me Cornelius Ashford was one of the honest ones. Alfred looked at the fire. Something moved across his face, affection and grief braided together in the way they always were when time had done some of its work but not all of it. He was, he said. He was exactly that. And honest men tend to believe that institutions work correctly because they would work correctly if honest men were running them. It made him trusting in ways that could be used against him. "And you?" she asked. "Are you trusting?" He looked at her across the fire, and there was a directness in his gaze that matched her own. "Not anymore," he said, "but I'm working on it." She almost smiled. She looked away before she let herself. The second day of riding brought them into the more settled country northeast of Santa Fe, where the road widened, and other travelers appeared, wagon trains moving supplies, riders in both directions. A small herd of sheep managed by a Pueblo shepherd who raised one hand in greeting as they passed. The land here was different in character from the Red Flats' gentler hills, more cottonwood along the watercourses, the distant blue mountains to the north. They had their one dangerous encounter at midday, in a narrow passage between two rocky outcroppings where the road temporarily became a single track. 3 riders were waiting. Louise had seen them before Alfred did. She had been watching the ridge lines with the automatic attention of someone trained in landscape reading, and she had reined her horse to a slow walk and said very quietly, "3 on the left ridge. They've been positioned, not traveling. Brock's men, most likely. Ride easy and keep your hands visible." Alfred had seen them then, sitting their horses above the road with the casual arrangement of men who wanted to be seen as a reminder rather than an ambush. One of them was Ned Garrity, who was Brock's ranch foreman and a man Alfred recognized. "Ashford," Garrity called down from the ridge. "Long way from home for a man who's about to lose his ranch anyway." Alfred said nothing. He rode through the passage at an even pace with his hands visible on the saddle horn, exactly as Louise had instructed, and she rode beside him with the same deliberate calm, and neither of them looked back when the passage opened out behind them. "You knew they were watching the road," Alfred said when they were clear. "I knew someone would be. The question was where and whether they intended violence or theater." "Those 3 were theater." She glanced at him. "If they intended violence, they would not have let us see them first." He processed that. "You've dealt with this kind of thing before." "I've worked in territories where the law is a suggestion and the land is disputed." "Yes." She said it without drama, the way someone describes having learned to swim because they lived near water. "Brock is trying to frighten you into stopping. If he can't frighten you, his next move will be legal obstruction, and the move after that depends on how much he's invested in taking your water." "He's built infrastructure on the assumption that my allocation is void," Alfred said. "He's invested significantly. If the deed overturns the lapse, he loses the entire North Fork diversion. Then the stakes are high enough that he'll escalate before he folds," Louise said. "We need to move fast once we have the document." They reached Santa Fe on the evening of the second day and took separate rooms at a boarding house on Palace Avenue. Louise was at the Territorial Land Office when it opened the following morning. Alfred stood outside. He stood outside for 4.5 hours, watching the street traffic of Santa Fe, the mix of Anglo settlers, Mexican residents, and Pueblo people that gave this old city its particular layered character. The mule-drawn wagons and the foot traffic, and the smell of baking bread and wood smoke drifting from the residences behind the main street. He watched 2 politicians arguing outside the palace of the governors. He watched a blacksmith working. He bought coffee from a street vendor and drank it and thought about Louise Talmadge and tried to stop thinking about Louise Talmadge and failed. He was not accustomed to needing people. He was not accustomed to sitting outside a building while someone else solved his problems. The combination of those 2 facts was doing something uncomfortable and interesting to his sense of himself. When Louise came out, she was carrying a leather satchel with 3 rolled documents inside it, and her expression was controlled, but her eyes were alive with the particular brightness of someone who has found what they were looking for in the exact place they predicted it would be. "The original deed exists," she said, without preamble, as she walked past him toward the boarding house. "The Territorial Land Office has a certified copy in their archive. Your father filed correctly in 1873 using residential agricultural language, which means under the 1873 Act, no renewal was required, and the lapse mechanism Brock cited does not apply. The lapse entry in the county record is fraudulent." She turned to face him, stopping in the middle of the street. "Wendell Price, your county clerk, falsified a public record. That is a territorial criminal offense." Alfred stared at her. He said nothing for a moment. The complexity of what she had just done, the 4.5 hours of archive searching and cross-referencing that had produced a weapon against a fraud that had nearly destroyed him, settled on him with a weight that was oddly clarifying. "Thank you," he said. She studied him with those level dark eyes. "You should know," she said more quietly, "that the certified copy alone may not be enough. Price and Brock will fight it." Brock has influence with Judge Pemberton, and Pemberton will be slow if he can be. We need to get in front of the judge before Brock knows we have the document. How fast? We ride back today. Tonight if we can manage it. And we go to the courthouse first before we go to the ranch. They left Santa Fe 2 hours later, with fresh horses rented from a livery on the South Road, riding at a pace that was hard but manageable. They pushed through the fading afternoon and into the early dark, navigating the Mesa Road by moonlight and the knowledge of familiar country, and Louise rode as though she had been born to it, with the easy seat and the subtle horse management of someone who had spent years covering long distances in difficult terrain. Alfred watched her in the way that a person watches something that challenges their assumptions, quietly and with growing certainty. He had known women of extraordinary quality before. His mother had been one. But there was something specific and rare about Louise Talmadge that was distinct from anything he had encountered, a combination of intellectual precision and physical competence and emotional self-possession that operated without any of the performance he had been trained by his world to expect from women. She was not working to impress him. She was not working to reassure him. She was simply doing the work at full capacity, and the fact that he was present was irrelevant to the quality of her effort. He thought about what that meant. He thought about it for a long stretch of night riding, with the stars immense above the mesa and the horses moving steadily south, and he arrived at a conclusion that startled him with its simplicity. He was falling in love with her. Not the soft, slow fall of comfort and familiarity. Something faster and sharper, the kind of fall that happens when you encounter something real in a landscape of imitations. He had been looking at the world through the lens of what he thought he knew, and Louise Talmadge had walked into his understanding like a surveyor walks into disputed land and started measuring. He said nothing. This was not the moment. They were carrying documents that could end Silas Brock's theft and restore water to 2,000 cattle and 12,000 acres of land, and they were riding through the night in country where Brock's men might be watching. He kept his feelings where they belonged and kept his eyes on the road. They reached the county seat of Crockett at dawn. And here was Louise, standing in the courthouse with dust on her boots and the deed on the judge's desk, and Silas Brock red-faced and furious across the room, making accusations of forgery with the thin urgency of a man whose foundation has just cracked. Judge Harlan Pemberton was not a bad man. He was a careful man, a cautious man, a man who had managed his career in the territorial judiciary by avoiding the kind of decisive action that made enemies. He took his time with the deed, reading it once and then reading it again, and then reading the second document, Wendell Price's confession, which Louise had obtained through a visit to Price's home the previous evening, stopping there before the courthouse. Price had not required much persuasion. He had been visibly frightened since the moment Louise knocked on his door at 2 in the morning, and when she had laid before him the certified copy from Santa Fe and explained, calmly and precisely, that the Territorial Archive would confirm his entry as fraudulent, and that the penalty for falsifying public records in New Mexico Territory was up to 3 years in a territorial prison. Wendell Price had sat down at his kitchen table with a pen and confessed in full. Silas Brock had paid him $200 to make the lapse entry in October of 1881. Price had removed the original deed from the Ashford strongbox himself in the summer of 1880 during the fire, when Alfred's father and the ranch hands were fighting the blaze at the barn. Price had entered the house and taken the deed from the strongbox. He had not destroyed it. He had given it to Brock. This last fact was important. "Where is the original deed?" Judge Pemberton asked, setting down the documents and looking at Brock with an expression that was no longer merely cautious. It was alarmed. Brock said nothing. His lawyer, a man named Caldwell who had been sitting beside him, leaned in and whispered something urgently in his ear. "Mr. Brock," Pemberton said, with more force than Alfred had ever heard from that bench, "this court requires an answer. From outside the courthouse there was a sound horses fast pulling up hard on the packed earth of the main street. The door opened and County Sheriff Davis Halst came in with a deputy, and behind Halst came one of Alfred's ranch hands, a young man named Carver, breathing hard. "Judge," Halst said, "we found the original deed. Brock's foreman Garrity had it in his saddlebag when we stopped him at the South Road this morning. Man was riding hard for the Texas border. He produced a folded document in a leather sleeve. Garrity is in custody." The room rearranged itself around that moment, every face shifting, every calculation changing. Brock's lawyer stood up. Brock himself stood up, and the fury in his face was the fury of a hidden motive finally, completely exposed. He had built his entire acquisition of the Cottonwood Creek water on a fraud, and the fraud was now lying in 3 versions on the judge's desk. The certified copy from Santa Fe, the falsified lapse entry, Price's confession, and the original deed was in the sheriff's hands. Alfred did not look at Brock. He looked at Louise. She was already looking at him. And in that moment, across the crowded, noisy, rearranging room, something passed between them that had nothing to do with water rights or legal documents or the territorial code. It was simpler and more dangerous than any of that. It was recognition. Judge Pemberton made his ruling that afternoon, after 4 hours of formal proceeding that involved the reading of all documents into the record, the testimony of Sheriff Halst regarding the recovery of the original deed, and the formal presentation of Wendell Price's signed confession. The lapse entry was declared fraudulent and expunged from the county record. The Ashford water allocation, as established by the original 1873 deed and confirmed by the certified territorial copy, was restored in full. Silas Brock's diversion dam was ordered removed within 30 days at Brock's expense. Brock and Price were referred to the territorial prosecutor. The ruling was clear and complete, and left no room for the quiet obstruction that Brock had hoped Pemberton's caution might provide. Louise had structured the presentation of evidence to make ambiguity impossible, and Pemberton, to his credit, had followed the evidence where it led. Outside the courthouse, in the dry heat of the early afternoon, Alfred stood beside his horse and looked at the main street of Crockett and felt the particular lightness of a man who has been carrying a crushing weight and has just put it down. Louise came out behind him, satchel in hand, and stood beside him in the shade of the courthouse overhang, and they were both quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet after something enormous has concluded. "It's done," he said. "It is," she agreed. He turned to look at her. She had repinned her hair while they waited, and she looked steadier than he had any right to expect from someone who had ridden through the night and delivered a legal coup before breakfast. There was dust still on her coat and a smudge of ink on the inside of her right wrist from the document work, and she was more beautiful to him in that moment than he had words for. "I owe you considerably more than your stated rate," he said. "You owe me the stated rate," she said. "That was the agreement." The stated rate did not account for riding through the night or persuading a frightened clerk to confess at 2 in the morning. She considered this. Those were within the scope of the job as it developed. Louise. He said her name, and the directness of it without formality made her still. "I know you don't require anything from me. You've made that thoroughly clear, and I respect it absolutely. But I would like to say something that is not about water rights or fees or professional scope." She waited. The street noise continued around them, a wagon passing, voices from the saloon 2 doors down, a dog barking, but it felt very distant. "I have never met anyone like you," Alfred said. "Not in 29 years of life in this territory or anywhere else. And I am aware that you are entirely complete without any addition from me, which is precisely the thing I find extraordinary about you. I am not asking for anything immediate, but I would like very much to not lose whatever this is, once the professional relationship concludes." She was quiet for a long moment. He watched her think, the real thinking, not the performed consideration that people offered when they wanted to seem deliberate. She was actually deciding. "Come for supper on Sunday," she said finally. I'll cook. He nodded once. Sunday. She walked to her horse, untied it from the rail, and mounted with the same easy economy of motion as always. Bring Domingo if he wants to come. He was fond of my father. Alfred watched her ride east out of Crockett toward the sandstone ridge, and the feeling in his chest was something he hadn't felt since he was young enough to believe that good things happened without requiring everything from you. Sunday came after 3 days of work. The ranch work that the water crisis had let pile up, the deferred maintenance, the stock tanks that needed cleaning and checking, the fences that had been neglected during the weeks of legal crisis. Alfred worked harder than usual, which was saying something, because he always worked hard, and his hands were aware of the change in him even if they couldn't name it. Carver caught Alfred whistling while he was mending a section of fence on Thursday and filed the observation away for later use in speculation. He rode to the Talmadge homestead on Sunday with Domingo, who was dressed in his good shirt and who had brought a jar of preserved peaches because, as he explained, one did not arrive at a good woman's table empty-handed. Alfred had not brought anything, and this omission was pointed out to him with elderly asperity. Louise had cooked a proper meal: roasted pork with dried chili and onion, beans cooked from scratch with some kind of herb that Alfred couldn't identify but that Domingo recognized immediately as episode, cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet, and a dried apple cake for dessert. The table was set in the main room of the homestead, which was small and clean and absolutely covered in her father's books and maps, and now, in Louise's own papers, survey notes and territorial documents, and what appeared to be an ongoing project of organizing and cataloging her father's professional archive. Domingo moved through the space with the careful tenderness of someone walking in a house full of old memories. He had known Thomas Talmadge for 20 years, he said, and Thomas had been a man who understood that the land held stories whether you were looking for them or not. He used to say that every boundary line was a negotiation, Louise said, setting the pork on the table, and that the only honest negotiation was the one where both parties knew exactly what they were giving up. Wise man, Domingo said. Alfred looked at the maps on the wall of the main room. They were detailed and precise, drawn in a fine hand. Some of them were clearly official, the work of the Territorial Land Office, with official stamps and notations. Others were different in character, more personal, drawn in the same fine hand but with annotations that were informal, observations rather than official notes. "Did you draw these?" he asked Louise. She looked up from the table. "The ones with the red notation lines are mine. The others are my father's." He looked at the map of the immediate county region, the Red Flats, the Canyon Country, the watershed of Cottonwood Creek. It was extraordinarily detailed, more detailed than any map he had ever seen of this land he had lived on for his entire life. The way the water moved through the landscape was mapped with a precision that suddenly explained many things he had always known instinctively, but never seen articulated. "This is the Cottonwood watershed," he said. "Yes. I mapped it 3 years ago as part of a survey project for the land office. That map is actually why I knew the lapse mechanism didn't apply to your allocation. I know this watershed's allocation history because I studied it when I was drawing the map." She came to stand beside him, looking at it. "Your father's allocation point is here." She indicated a mark on the map with one finger, very close to where he was standing. "Brock's diversion was here." Another mark upstream. "Removing it will restore full flow to this point within a week, possibly less." He was aware of her beside him, the warmth and the particular quality of her attention, which was always so precisely directed, always fully deployed. "You knew everything about this property before you ever opened my father's documents," he said. "I knew the land," she said. "The documents confirmed what the land already told me." He turned to look at her, and they were standing close in the small room, and the awareness between them had reached a point where acknowledging it was simpler than continuing to not acknowledge it. "I'd like to take you riding sometime," he said. Not for any professional purpose, just to show you the part of the property where the creek comes down through the Red Canyon in the mornings. She held his gaze. I've seen that canyon, she said. I mapped it. Not with me, he said. There was a beat of silence, and then Domingo's voice came from the kitchen where he had wandered, ostensibly to refill his coffee. The pork is getting cold. Louise's mouth curved, a real smile, one that reached her eyes and changed the whole cast of her face, and she turned back to the table. Alfred followed, and the meal proceeded with a warmth and ease that none of the three of them remarked on, because to remark on it would have been to make it self-conscious, and it was too good for that. Domingo told stories about the early years of the Ashford ranch, the founding, the first winter, the time Cornelius had negotiated with a band of Comanche traders for 50 horses and ended up with 62 horses and a dispute about a blanket that took 3 months to resolve to everyone's satisfaction. Alfred told stories about the survey projects he had watched his father navigate, the constant negotiation of the frontier between people with different relationships to land and law and ownership. Louise listened and told her own stories in return. The years with the land office, the survey expeditions into difficult country, the time she had spent 3 days on a canyon rim waiting for a flash flood to subside before she could complete a boundary measurement. Were you frightened? Alfred asked. Of the flood, no, floods are honest. They do exactly what the water and the terrain require. It's people who are frightening. Brock's variety, he said, every variety. People with hidden motives are frightening because the threat is invisible until it arrives. She was quiet for a moment. My father had a partner once, before he had me, before my mother died. A land agent he went into business with, surveying and filing claims. The man betrayed him, filed claims that overlapped and sold the same land twice, then vanished with the profit and left my father to deal with the fraud. She said it without particular emotion, the way one describes weather from years ago. My father recovered. It took 5 years and most of his savings. But it taught me very early that the hidden deed, the thing not on the visible record, is always more important than what people show you first. Alfred looked at her. The hidden deed, he said softly. It's a metaphor, she said, looking at him steadily. Every person has one. The real terms of who they are, filed somewhere deeper than the surface record. And what does yours say? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. That I want to do work that matters with my full capacity, and that I do not want to be diminished by the life I live. That I want to be known accurately, not approximately. She paused. What does yours say? He was quiet for a moment. That I've been managing this ranch and this grief and this crisis as though being strong enough and working hard enough would eventually be sufficient, and that I am beginning to understand that sufficiency and meaning are not the same thing. Something changed in the room. Not dramatically. There was no declaration, no gesture. Just the quiet recognition of two people who have seen each other's real documents and found them consistent. Domingo stood up and said he was tired and would sleep in the barn, with such practiced nonchalance that both Alfred and Louise looked at him with the same expression. You don't have to sleep in the barn, Louise said. I prefer it, Domingo said with complete conviction. Horses are good company. He took his coffee cup to the kitchen, and they heard the back door open and close. Alfred and Louise sat by the fire that had burned down to coals in the small stone fireplace, and the lamplight made the room amber and close, and Louise had pulled her knees up and was looking at the coals with an expression that was open in a way he hadn't seen before, less deployed, less directed, more simply present. I'm going to stay in the Red Flats, she said, after a while. I had thought when I came back in April that I would sell the homestead and return to Santa Fe. But I've been working on my father's archive, and I've been mapping again, and this country is the country I know best. She looked at him sideways. I've accepted a contract from the Territorial Land Office to complete the remaining boundary surveys for the Eastern District. I'll be based here for at least 2 years. That is good news, Alfred said carefully, from several perspectives. She smiled at the fire. Several. He reached across the small space between them and set his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. It was a quiet gesture, deliberate without being dramatic, asking without demanding. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and they sat by the dying fire for a long time, without saying anything else that needed to be said with words. The summer moved on in the way that good summers do after crisis, with a sense of earned ease, with the particular pleasure of watching things recover that had been threatened. The Brock diversion dam was removed within the court's 30-day order, and the hands who did the work reported that the upper fork of Cottonwood Creek began moving within hours of the dam's removal, and by the following morning the main creek was running full and clear into the Ashford property. The main stock tank filled within 4 days. Alfred stood at the tank one morning and watched 200 head of cattle come down to drink, and the relief he felt was physical. It went through him like water through dry ground. Silas Brock did not go quietly. He filed 3 separate legal challenges to the Pemberton ruling over the following 6 weeks, and each one was resolved by the territorial court in Santa Fe with reference to the same documentation that Louise had assembled. Brock's lawyer was good, but the evidence was better, and better evidence was Louise's professional specialty. She handled each challenge with the calm efficiency of someone swatting flies, methodical, complete, and without undue expenditure of energy. Wendell Price pleaded guilty to falsifying public records and was sentenced to 18 months in the territorial facility at Santa Fe. Brock himself was charged with criminal fraud and conspiracy, and the proceedings dragged through the fall with the slow momentum of territorial justice, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The full evidence was too complete. It was the kind of case where the hidden motive had been dragged entirely into the open, and there was nowhere left for it to hide. Alfred and Louise moved through the summer and into the fall in a rhythm that felt at once entirely natural, and like nothing either of them had experienced before. He rode to her property or she rode to his, 2 or 3 times a week, and sometimes they worked. He helped her carry equipment for her survey expeditions, and she helped him with the boundary disputes that inevitably arose on a large ranch operating in country where the law was still being written, and sometimes they simply were present together without any agenda beyond that. He showed her the red canyon where the creek came down in the mornings. She stood at the canyon's edge in the early light with the water sound rising from below and the red walls catching the first sun, and her expression was the expression of someone encountering something that confirms a belief they have held for a long time. "I mapped this from the rim," she said. "I didn't come down to the water. The water is the best part." "Yes," she agreed. "It usually is." He had kissed her for the first time there at the canyon's rim, with the morning light on the red walls and the sound of the creek below, and she had kissed him back with the same completeness with which she did everything fully present, no reservation held back for performance's sake, entirely real. He had pulled back after a moment and looked at her, and her eyes were open and very clear, and she said, "I should tell you that I am not accustomed to this feeling, and I intend to be precise about it. I don't want to be a person who mistakes something large for something manageable. I don't want you to manage it," he said. "I want you to feel it." She studied him for a moment. "That is a terrifying suggestion from a practical standpoint." "I know, I find it terrifying too." He paused. "But I've been managing things at the expense of feeling them for 3 years, and I am finished with that approach." She looked at the canyon below, where the water moved in its ancient bed, careless and clear and absolutely certain of its direction. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." The fall survey work took Louise through the eastern district of the county, long days in the saddle, nights in camp, or in the small ranch settlements that dotted the survey area. She sent Alfred reports on her progress in letters that were formally professional in structure and deeply personal in their secondary content, and he read them twice each time and kept them in the drawer of his desk, which was something he acknowledged to himself but not to anyone else. He came out to meet her twice during the survey period, riding 2 days to where she was working in the canyon country near the eastern county boundary, and they spent those evenings talking about everything. About what the ranch could be if the water was reliable and the finances stabilized, about the survey work and what it revealed about the land's true character, about their fathers and the things they had inherited from them, and the things they were choosing differently, about the way the territory was changing, the railroads moving through and the settlements growing, and the old patterns of the land being rewritten faster than anyone fully understood. The Pueblo people have been watching all of this with the patience of people who have seen empires come and go, Louise said one evening, looking at the distant village lights on the mesa to the northwest. My father always said that the only way to understand this land honestly was to understand that it was not empty before we arrived, and that the people who were here first have a knowledge of it that no survey map can fully capture. My father traded with the Pueblo communities for 30 years, Alfred said. He said the same thing, that the land held a history that predated the surveyor's line, and that the wise thing was to work with that history rather than against it. Most people don't, Louise said. No, but we can, she looked at him. Is that an we in the general sense? It's an we in whatever sense you'll let it be, he said. She reached for his hand in the dark, and they sat watching the mesa lights until the cold drove them to their separate bedrolls, but the word, the we of it, the particular we, stayed in the air between them all through the night. He proposed to her in November, in the early morning on the porch of the Talmadge homestead, with frost on the ground and the coffee hot in their hands, and the red flats turning gold and amber in the early light. He had thought about how to do it for weeks, and in the end he did it with the same directness that she herself favored. No performance, no elaborate staging, just the plain truth of it. I want to build a life with you, he said. A real one, where you are exactly who you are without modification, where the survey work and the law work and the land knowledge is as central to our life as the ranching, where we are partners in the full sense. I am asking you to marry me, Louise, and I am asking it because I believe you are the best person I have ever encountered, and because my life is specifically and demonstrably better in every dimension when you are part of it. She was quiet for a long moment. He waited. I need you to understand something, she said. I have watched women in this territory become invisible within their marriages. I have watched capable women become extensions of their husbands' identities, their own work and knowledge absorbed into the husband's narrative without acknowledgement. I will not permit that to happen, not because I am unkind, but because it destroys the thing you claim to value. I understand, he said. And I want you to know that the thing I value, the precise, specific, remarkable thing, is you as you are, not a version of you that fits more comfortably into what people expect. If you become invisible in this marriage, then I have failed at the fundamental thing. She looked at him for a long time. You mean that? I mean it completely. She set her coffee cup on the porch railing. Then yes, she said. Yes. He kissed her then, and she kissed him back, and the frost glittered on the red flats around them, and the morning opened over the sandstone country like a door. They married in December 1883, in a small ceremony at the Crockett County Church, with Domingo as a witness, and the county sheriff Davis Halst and his wife, and a scattering of neighbors from both properties in attendance. Louise wore a dark blue wool dress that she had made herself from material ordered from a catalog, and she wore her hair up with her mother's comb in it, a small silver comb that had come across the country in a trunk when her mother had traveled from the East as a young woman. Alfred wore his good dark coat and his cleanest shirt and looked, several witnesses reported, like a man standing on the edge of the best thing that had ever happened to him. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones, and they said them without irony and without reservation, and the words fell into the cold December air with a particular weight, the weight of things freely chosen by people who understood precisely what they were choosing. They returned that night to the Ashford ranch house, which Domingo had prepared with a fire and a proper meal, and then quietly absented himself from, taking up residence in the bunkhouse with an air of perfect contentment. They ate beside the fire, and they talked as they always talked, about everything, about the coming year and the survey contracts and the winter preparations for the ranch and the territorial case against Brock that was proceeding through the courts. And then they were quiet together in the way that people are quiet when words are insufficient to the moment. And the night was cold outside, and the fire was warm inside, and the world beyond the ranch house walls was very large and very full of uncertainty, and it mattered less than it had in years. The winter that year was honest, cold, and clear and manageable. Snow came in January and covered the red flats in white silence, and the creek ran clean under ice at the edges and open in the middle, the way it was supposed to, the way it had run before the diversion. Alfred and his hands worked the winter chores with the particular ease of people who have been through something worse and came out the other side. Louise worked through the winter on 2 projects simultaneously: the ongoing organization of her father's archive, which was producing a comprehensive record of land allocation in the Eastern District going back to the 1840s, and her spring survey contract, for which she was preparing the documentation and equipment through the dark months so that when the ground thawed she could move immediately. She set up a working space in the ranch house, a large table in the east room where she could spread maps, a shelf for her reference books, an organized system of document folders that Alfred respected with the scrupulousness of a man who understood that another person's professional system was not to be disturbed. He sometimes sat in the room while she worked, reading or reviewing ranch records, and the quiet companionship of that shared space was something he valued with a depth he found difficult to articulate but had stopped trying to hide. She taught him to read a survey map with real precision, not just the basic orientation he'd had before, but the detailed reading of contour lines and watercourses and boundary markers that made the land legible in ways it had never been to him. He taught her things about cattle management and the specific ecology of the Red Flats grassland that complemented her survey knowledge in ways neither had anticipated. They were building something, and it was built from real material. In March, Louise told him she was carrying their first child. She told him in the morning over breakfast, in the same direct way that she told him everything, simply and clearly and without performance, but with something in her eyes that was vulnerable in a way she rarely permitted herself to be, because this was new territory for her, and she wanted to receive it honestly rather than manage it efficiently. Alfred set down his coffee and looked at her and felt something in his chest that was larger than his vocabulary for it. He reached across the table and took her hand. "How are you?" he asked. "Not are you happy or are you frightened, just that. How are you?" "I am very well," she said. "I am also somewhat terrified, but in the manner of something I want rather than something I am dreading." "That sounds right," he said. "That sounds exactly right." He was careful in the months that followed not to treat her differently on account of the pregnancy, not to suggest she ride less or work less or reach less, not to imply that the baby changed her capacity or her standing. She would have found that infantilizing and she would have told him so, and she would have been correct. But he was attentive in different ways, making sure the ranch house was warm before the morning chill, taking on the tasks that required heavy lifting without making a project of it, asking at the end of each day how she was in that same simple, direct way. She, in turn, was honest about the physical reality of pregnancy in ways that she might not have been with someone she trusted less. The fatigue in the first months, the adjustment, the way the survey work required more planning as her body changed. She completed the spring survey contract, covering the Eastern District boundary work she had committed to through May and into June, writing carefully and working thoroughly, and delivering the documentation on schedule. Her father's archive was cataloged by summer. The complete record, organized by date and territory and type of document, was bound into a series of ledgers and filed with both the Territorial Land Office and a personal copy she kept at the ranch. It was, in the quiet assessment of the Land Office archivist who received it, one of the most comprehensive historical land records ever compiled for the Eastern District. Louise received this assessment with the satisfaction of a job done correctly, which was the most she ever expected. Their son was born in November 1884 in the ranch house, with a midwife from Crockett who arrived in time and a storm outside that didn't. Alfred was present throughout, which was unusual for the time but which Louise had simply made plain was expected, and which he would not have been anywhere but present for regardless. The labor was long and difficult, long enough that Louise's characteristic self-possession gave way to something rower and realer, and Alfred sat beside her through all of it, holding her hand and talking to her in the low, steady voice he used with frightened horses, and she was not frightened exactly, but she was grateful for the anchor. The boy arrived at 4 in the morning on a November night with the storm shaking the windows and the fire going high, and he announced himself with a voice that seemed excessive for something so new and small, and Louise looked at him with an expression of absolute wonder, not the performed wonder that she might have offered an audience but the genuine, unstoppable astonishment of encountering something entirely real. They named him Thomas Cornelius Ashford, after both their fathers. Thomas was a vigorous child, loud and curious and inclined toward motion, who met the world with a directness that seemed to come from both sides of his inheritance. Domingo claimed him immediately as a personal responsibility and spent hours telling the baby, in both English and Spanish, about the history of the ranch and the territory and the proper way to make cornbread, none of which the baby could process, but all of which seemed to please both parties immensely. The months following were not without difficulty. The territorial cattle market had a bad season in 1885, and the debt to the First Territorial Bank required renegotiating. Alfred handled the financial side with the stubborn patience his father had taught him, not panicking, not overreacting, making the methodical adjustments that kept the operation viable without sacrificing the long-term structure. Louise's survey contracts provided income that supplemented the ranch in the lean season, a practical value that Alfred acknowledged openly, and that she accepted without either false modesty or exaggerated significance. Silas Brock's criminal fraud case concluded in the spring of 1885. He was found guilty on 3 counts of conspiracy and fraud and sentenced to 4 years in the territorial prison. His land and cattle holdings were put into receivership. The Brock Land and Cattle Company, which had been built substantially on the appropriation of others' rights through manufactured legal fraud, dissolved. Several smaller ranchers and landowners who had lost property or water rights to Brock's operation over the preceding decade filed civil claims against the estate, and some of them recovered partial restitution. Alfred testified at the trial clearly and precisely, with none of the anger he had carried through the crisis, but with the full weight of what had happened and what it had cost. Afterward, on the courthouse steps in Santa Fe, he stood with Louise and felt the last of the dark weight of it leave him. Not because justice was perfect, it wasn't, it never was, but because the fraud was on the record now, completely and publicly, and the hidden motive had been fully exposed, and Cottonwood Creek was running freely through his property and would continue to run. "It's over," he said. "That part is," she said. She was holding Thomas, who was 4 months old and had been thoroughly unimpressed by the territorial courthouse. "The next part is starting." They rode home to the Red Flats on a May evening, with the country green from spring rains and the creek running clear through the canyon, and Domingo had prepared a meal that was entirely excessive in scope and perfectly justified in every component, and they sat at the table in the ranch house. The 3 of them plus Thomas, who sat in a basket near the fire and regarded the adults with the sovereign interest of a very young person discovering the world is larger than expected. Over the following years, the Ashford Ranch settled into a new character. It was still a cattle operation, that was its core and its foundation, but it was other things as well. Louise's surveying work continued to generate contracts and a reputation that extended beyond the immediate county, and the ranch house became a place where her professional life was fully integrated rather than separated. Alfred expanded the horse breeding side of the operation, developing a line of working horses that had a good reputation among the ranchers and small farmers of the Eastern District. They were both, in their ways, known quantities in the county by the late 1880s. Alfred Ashford was known as a straight-dealing man who had fought a corrupt legal fraud and won, and who ran his ranch with the kind of quiet integrity that was rare enough to be notable. Louise Ashford, she had taken his name professionally as well as personally, though her survey work had built its own reputation under her maiden name that was already too established to change, was known as the woman who could read land better than anyone in the territory, and who had, it was widely understood, been the one to find the fraud and dig out the proof, while her husband stood outside the land office and waited. Alfred had never once minded that characterization. He had told the story accurately himself, on every occasion it came up. He found a particular satisfaction in it, in the specificity of her achievement and the accuracy of his own role in it. He had been the one who asked for help from someone capable. That was, he thought, a good thing to have done. In 1887, Louise was offered a formal position with the Territorial Land Office, a senior survey analyst position in Santa Fe, overseeing the documentation standards for the entire territorial survey program. It was a significant appointment, the kind that had not previously been offered to a woman in the territory. She and Alfred talked about it for 3 evenings at the table after Thomas was asleep, going through it carefully and honestly. "If I take it, we would need to divide our time," she said. "Santa Fe for 3 months at a stretch, then the Red Flats. It's manageable if we're organized, but it means the ranch runs without me for periods." "The ranch ran before you," Alfred said. "Not as well, but it ran. And this is your work, Louise. The survey program for the whole territory, that's the scale your capacity is meant to operate at." She looked at him. "You're not saying this to be generous." "I'm saying it because it's true and because we have both agreed that your work is as central to this life as mine, and I intend to keep that agreement." She took the position. The arrangement they worked out was practical and functional. She traveled to Santa Fe for her official periods. Alfred managed the ranch and Thomas during those times with the help of a woman named Clara Rios, who joined the household as a combination cook and childminder, and who was, within 2 months, indispensable in every respect. Louise was home for her off periods, which were longer than the Santa Fe periods, and during those months the ranch house was full of the particular energy of her full presence. The maps on the table, the late evenings of document work, Thomas learning to walk between the table legs and making confident assertions in the bilingual mixture of English and Spanish that Domingo was raising him in. Thomas grew up with an understanding of land and law and the natural world that was the direct inheritance of both his parents' knowledge. He was a serious child, quick with numbers and quieter than his parents in social situations, with his mother's precision and his father's stubbornness, and a quality of deep attention that seemed to be entirely his own. He trailed after Alfred on the ranch from the time he could walk, and he trailed after Louise in her study with equal devotion, and the ranch hands regarded him with the particular affection reserved for children who are clearly going to grow up to be remarkable and are entirely unaware of it. In the fall of 1888, Louise came home from a Santa Fe period with news that she delivered at the kitchen table with the same directness as always. A second child was coming. Alfred received this with the same immediate steadiness with which he received all major information, a moment of stillness, and then the full engagement of his attention. "How are you?" The same question, the same essential care. "I am very well," she said. "Tired, but well." Thomas, age 4, received the news with intense interest and considerable practical questioning about the logistics of infant housing. Louise answered every question with complete seriousness, which Thomas found appropriate. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1889, another boy, born in the same room as his brother, with the same midwife and the same May weather and considerably less dramatic labor. They named him James Henry Ashford James for no particular antecedent, simply because it suited him, and Henry for Domingo, whose given name was Enrique, who had been present at the founding of the ranch and the raising of Alfred and the establishment of everything that the family now was. Domingo, upon learning the middle name, went to his room and cried quietly for 20 minutes and then came back and prepared a meal that was even more excessive than the one after Thomas's birth. James was different in character from his brother, easier physically, more immediately social, with a quick laugh that he deployed freely and the kind of uncomplicated warmth that made everyone around him feel welcomed. Where Thomas was his mother's careful child, James was immediately his father's easy company, riding up in the saddle before he was 3, and regarding the horses with the confident affection of someone who has always known they belong there. The boys grew up in a household where both their parents worked and both their parents were known and respected for different things, and where the combination of those different things, the land knowledge and the legal history and the practical management and the careful precision, was presented to them not as unusual but as normal. It was normal to know how to read a survey map. It was normal to know why the water rights mattered and how they had been defended. It was normal for the woman of the house to ride out on professional business and for the man of the house to manage the domestic space in her absence, and for this to require no comment. They were fortunate, and they knew it. They were not free of difficulty. No life in the territory in those years was free of difficulty. There were seasons of hard weather and financial strain, and the general uncertainty of frontier life. And there was grief, because Domingo died in the winter of 1890 at the age of approximately 77, peacefully in his sleep in the bunkhouse he had preferred for 50 years, and the loss of him was a particular kind of grief that went through the entire household like weather. He had been present at the beginning of the ranch and had outlasted 2 generations of Ashfords, and the thing he had built in that place, the continuity of it, the cooking and the storytelling and the deep, undemonstrative love of it, was something they all felt as a physical absence. They buried him on the ranch, under the cottonwood trees near the creek, and Alfred made a marker with the name and the dates and the words. He made this place a home. Louise added a small surveyor's mark below it, the kind she put on maps when she was noting a point of permanent importance. Thomas, who was 6, put a handful of late autumn leaves on the grave and said carefully that he was going to learn to cook epazote beans correctly in honor of Domingo, which was both sweet and impractical and entirely consistent with who Thomas was. Clara Rio stepped more fully into the household role after Domingo's death, and her family, a sister and an elderly uncle, joined the ranch operation over the following 2 years in a gradual and entirely natural expansion that suited everyone. The ranch grew in a managed way through the 1890s, adding acreage when it became available on terms that were honest, breeding horses that developed a regional reputation, maintaining the water allocation with the careful legal attention that Louise considered a fundamental responsibility, and that never required anything like the crisis of 1883 again, because the record was now so thoroughly documented and so publicly established that no one attempted to disturb it. Alfred was 39 years old at the turn of the decade of the 1890s, and he was the kind of man who had grown into himself fully. The ruggedness of the early years deepened by experience into something quieter and more substantial, the physical capability still entirely present but worn now with the ease of something that doesn't need to assert itself. He was content in the specific and particular way of a man who has found the work that suits him and the person who suits him, and has not wasted either. Louise was 36, and she had expanded her professional scope in ways that, when she stopped to consider them, were satisfying in a manner beyond the professional. The territorial survey program under her oversight had produced a standardized, accurate, publicly accessible record that resolved dozens of land disputes across the territory, because accurate information in the hands of honest administrators was, as her father had always said, the best possible preventive against the kind of fraud that had nearly taken Cottonwood Creek. She had testified before the territorial legislature twice on land law reform. She had published 2 papers on survey methodology that were read, to her genuine surprise, by professionals as far away as Colorado and Arizona. She was exactly who she had told Alfred she needed to be, and she was it within a life that held everything she had not known she wanted until it was in front of her. The man who read her correctly, the boys who astonished her daily with their specific selves, the ranch that was her home in the fullest sense, the creek running clean through the canyon where she had first kissed Alfred, and the red walls had been going golden in the morning light. They had a conversation one evening in the fall of 1891, sitting on the porch of the ranch house with the twilight coming down over the red flats and the boys asleep inside, and the sound of the creek carrying on the cool air. They had been married 8 years, and the talk was easy in the way of people who have talked through everything and still find more to say. "Do you remember standing outside the land office in Santa Fe?" Louise asked. Alfred smiled at the darkening plain. "For 4.5 hours. You bought coffee from a street vendor. I bought 3 coffees from a street vendor. It was a long wait. You looked like a man who was trying very hard not to go inside and try to help when he knew he would only get in the way." He laughed, a real laugh, low and genuine. "That is an accurate description of the entire experience." "I noticed that," she said. "I was watching from the window." "Were you?" "You stayed out, you bought your coffees, you waited." She paused. "Do you know how rare that is? A man who knows his own limits and keeps them without resentment." He was quiet for a moment. "I think I was more shocked than anything. I had gone in expecting to need to help, and I found that what I was actually there for was to be present. It was a new experience. And it was better," he said. "Being present turned out to be better." She reached for his hand on the arm of the chair, the way she had that first night at the canyon's rim, lacing her fingers through his with the same unhurried certainty. "I found the deed," she said. "But you found me. Both things had to happen." "Both things happened," he agreed. The night settled over the red flats, the vast, star-filled dark of the New Mexico territory in autumn, the sound of the creek below the canyon, the warm light from the ranch house windows behind them. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, 2 of the hands were playing guitar. The music drifted up thin and sweet in the cold air. Alfred Ashford sat on his porch with his wife's hand in his, and looked at everything he had, and everything it had cost to keep it, and everything it had required to build it. And he felt the full, specific gratitude of a man who understands that the best things in his life came not from what he could manage alone, but from the moment he recognized what he needed and was willing to ask for it honestly. And Louise Talmadge sat beside him under the enormous sky and thought about the hidden deed, not the paper one, the one in the archives, the one that had set everything in motion, but the other one, the metaphorical one, the real terms of who a person was filed somewhere deeper than the surface record. She had spent her life learning to read those documents accurately. She had read Alfred Ashford's on a porch in the early morning with frost on the ground and coffee in their hands, and everything that the document said had been consistent and true across 8 years of daily verification. No hidden clause, no fraudulent entry, the real thing. In the spring of 1893, they added 1,200 acres to the east of the original property, bringing the ranch to just over 13,000 acres total, almost exactly the size it would have been if Cornelius Ashford had been able to expand as planned in the 1870s before illness, and the manipulations of men like Brock had constrained him. Alfred thought of his father often in those days, working the expanded ground, running the fence lines through country that had been part of his father's original vision. Thomas, by that point 9 years old and intensely serious about everything he undertook, had developed a pronounced interest in law, specifically in land law, which surprised no one who had been watching him follow his mother around the study for years. He could read a survey map as well as any adult, and had asked Louise on his 8th birthday for his own set of survey tools, which she had provided without hesitation, and which he kept in a small wooden box with the same careful organization his mother used for her professional instruments. James, at 4, was entirely focused on horses and whether the horses were happy, a concern he prosecuted with absolute dedication and considerable charm. He had an instinctive ability with animals that exceeded his father's considerable skill in this area, and that caused Alfred to watch his younger son sometimes with the same quiet wonder with which Louise had once watched him. They were all, in their different ways, thriving. The ranch was stable and profitable, and the water ran clean and constant through Cottonwood Creek, and the evidence of all the work, the legal fight and the long survey days and the financial management and the daily physical labor, was visible everywhere in the land and the buildings and the animals and the people who lived among them. In the long accounting of a life, Alfred would say in later years that the crisis of 1883 had been the making of him, not because suffering was good for you in the abstract, but because it had been the specific occasion on which he had been willing to ask for help from someone more capable than himself, and that willingness had led him to Louise, and Louise was the essential thing. Everything else was built on that foundation. Louise would say, when asked, that the hidden deed had been there all along in the territorial archive, preserved and exact, waiting for someone who knew where to look and what they were looking at, that the fraud had depended on people not looking, and that the most important thing she had learned, both professionally and personally, was that the truth in a disputed record was always findable if you were willing to do the work thoroughly and without the distortion of fear. The deed had been hidden. She had found it. And everything that followed, the creek running through the canyon, the ranch growing green in the spring, the boys arguing over breakfast about the relative merits of surveying versus horse training, the evenings on the porch with Alfred's hand warm over hers and the music drifting up from the bunkhouse and the stars enormous over the red flats, all of it had been on the other side of that document, waiting to be recovered. She had done the work. They had built the life. And it was, by any honest measure, exactly what it was supposed to be. The New Mexico Territory became the state of New Mexico in 1912, when Thomas Ashford was 27 years old and had been practicing land law in Santa Fe for 3 years, and James Ashford was 22 and had one of the best-regarded horse breeding operations in the region, and Alfred and Louise Ashford were 58 and 55 years old respectively, and had been sitting on the porch of the ranch house watching the red flats together for nearly 30 years. They watched the statehood celebrations from their porch, the distant lights of Crockett's festivities visible on the plain, the sound of a brass band carried on the warm January air. Thomas had ridden down for the celebration with his young wife, a woman named Petra who had the same quality of direct, precise intelligence as her mother-in-law and who had accordingly been accepted into the family with great warmth. James was at the celebration with a group of friends, audible even at this distance because James's laugh carried. 30 years, Alfred said. Almost exactly, Louise agreed. The creek is still running. The creek will outlast all of us, she said. That was always the point. He turned to look at her in the evening light, the dark hair now threaded with silver, the face lined with the work and the weather and the living of a full life, the eyes still as direct and precise and specific as they had ever been. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and the beauty was not separate from the strength of her. It was the strength made visible. She looked back at him with the same steady assessment, and in it was 30 years of knowing and being known, of working beside someone whose real document had never once contradicted itself, whose hidden deed had turned out to contain exactly what it promised. "Thank you," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "For what specifically?" "For being exactly who you are." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the plain with the celebration lights on it and the old reliable stars above and the sound of the creek below, constant and clean. "Thank you for making space for it," she said. Not every man would have. Not every woman would have trusted the space to be real, he said. You took the risk. I took the evidence, she corrected gently. The evidence was overwhelming. He laughed, low and warm, and she smiled. And the night settled over the red flats the way it always had, immense and full of stars, with the creek running below the canyon and the ranch spreading out around them in the dark, and the life they had built together holding everything it was supposed to hold, clear and complete, the record fully intact.